The night Monroe Merritt rode toward Wilhelmina Talmadge's homestead with a burning torch in his saddlebag. He told himself he was just a man doing a job, and he believed that right up until the moment she opened the door. The year was 1878, and the territory of Wyoming was still raw and restless, a place where the law bent like tall grass in the wind and powerful men made their own rules simply because they had the money and the muscle to enforce them. The railroad had been pushing west for years, and with it came men like Harlan Crestwood, men who wore fine wool suits and carried ivory-handled walking sticks and spoke with the smooth polish of educated wolves. Crestwood had been acquiring land in the Powder River Basin for the better part of 2 years, buying parcels cheap when he could, pressuring when he could not buy, and burning when pressure failed. He was not an unusual figure in that era of westward expansion. He was, in fact, a very ordinary villain in a landscape full of them. Monroe Merritt was 28 years old that autumn, a tall man with dust permanently worked into the creases of his hands, and a jawline that women in the town of Casper had noticed before he had ever noticed them. He had ridden for Crestwood for 14 months, doing the sorts of tasks that did not require much thinking and paid better than cattle work. He was not a cruel man by nature. He had simply stopped asking questions at some point along the way a man sometimes stops feeling the cold after he has been outside long enough. He had delivered warnings. He had escorted families off land they could no longer afford to fight for, and he had watched 2 barns go up in flames set by other hands while he stood nearby doing nothing to stop it. He had told himself each time that those families had been compensated. He had told himself that Crestwood's lawyer had made fair offers. He had told himself many things. On the night of October the 14th, 1878, he was told that the Talmadge homestead on Willow Creek had to be cleared by morning. Crestwood wanted the land because the creek ran through it, and the railroad survey put a water stop right where the Talmadge kitchen garden sat. Crestwood had sent 2 letters, both rejected. He had sent his lawyer, who had come back reporting that the widow Talmadge had closed her door in his face with a civility that, by the lawyer's own account, had made it somehow worse than if she had shouted. So now it was Monroe's job. He had ridden out alone, which was unusual. Crestwood's foreman, a stocky, mean-tempered man named Deacon Prout, had offered to send 2 others along. Monroe had said he didn't need them, and the truth was he had wanted witnesses as few as possible, though he could not have told you precisely why he cared about that when he claimed not to care about anything much at all. The night was cold and clear, the way Wyoming nights in October have a particular quality of clarity, as though the sky has been scrubbed clean. Stars pressed low and bright. The sage smelled sharp and good, and Monroe's horse, a gray quarter horse he called Walker, moved steadily along the creek trail with the quiet confidence of an animal that had done night riding before. Monroe could see the homestead from about a quarter mile out. It was modest but solid, built in a way that told you the man who had originally put it up had known what he was doing. Squared log walls, a good shingle roof, a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke was still rising despite the late hour. There was a small barn set back to the left, and a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter, the staked rows of it still visible in the moonlight. A fence of split rails ran the perimeter, and along it someone had planted rose bushes that were now bare and skeletal but had clearly been tended with love during the warmer months. Monroe sat on Walker at the edge of the property and looked at all of it for a long moment. He had the torch in his saddlebag. He had matches in his coat pocket. The plan was simple enough. Set the outbuildings first, which would force her out, and then she would see there was no fighting it, and she would take what she could carry and leave. And by morning the homestead would be reduced to ash, and Crestwood's men would come out to survey the ruins and say it was a tragedy, but these things happen. Monroe had done enough not to be startled by the plan. He had not, however, actually set fire to a dwelling before. The barns he had witnessed had been empty. He did not know whether anyone was still up inside the house. The smoke from the chimney suggested a banked fire rather than an active one. All the windows were dark. He swung down from Walker and tied the horse to the fence post nearest the gate, and he reached into his saddlebag for the torch, which was a simple thing of wrapped rags soaked in pine resin. He had the matches in his left coat pocket, and he touched the box of them through the wool of the coat as he pushed the gate open and walked up the short path toward the barn. He was 4 steps from the barn door when the light came on in the house. Not the flickering of a candle being lit in a window, but the full warm glow of a lamp turned up, and it flooded across the frost-stiffened grass of the yard and reached him where he stood, and Monroe stopped walking. Then the door of the house opened. Wilhelmina Talmadge stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand and the other hand resting against the door frame, and she looked directly at him. She was 26 years old, though Monroe did not know that yet. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair that was loose at this hour and fell past her shoulders, and she was wearing a heavy wool wrapper over her nightdress, and her feet were in boots that she had clearly just pulled on because they were unlaced. Her face was calm, striking, Monroe thought, before he could stop himself from thinking it. The kind of face that a man remembered after looking at it once. She did not scream. She did not raise an alarm. She simply looked at him standing in her yard in the middle of the night with an unlit torch in his hand, and her expression was one of absolute, unnerving clarity, as though she had been expecting something very like this and had already decided what she thought about it. "It is a cold night to be standing in someone's yard," she said, and her voice was steady as a plumb line. Monroe could not move. He stood there with the unlit torch in his hand, and Walker standing at the fence behind him, and the cold October air pressing in around them both, and he simply could not make his feet carry him another step toward that barn. He could not have explained it to anyone's satisfaction, least of all his own. It was not fear. He had been afraid before, and he knew what fear felt like, and this was not it. It was something else entirely, something closer to what a man feels when he has been moving fast in a direction and suddenly sees a cliff edge materializing in front of him, and his body stops before his mind has finished processing why. She was watching him without flinching, and the lamplight moved over her face in the way that lamplight does when someone holds it at arm's length on a still night, liquid and warm and honest, and Monroe Merritt, who had stopped asking questions and stopped caring about a great many things, found that he was suddenly and acutely aware of every choice he had made in the last 14 months. "You had better come inside," Wilhelmina Talmadge said, "before you freeze solid out there." It was the most unexpected thing anyone had ever said to him, and that was saying something because Monroe had lived an unexpectedly varied life. He stood for another few seconds, and then he did something he had not planned to do. He looked down at the torch in his hand, and then he turned and walked back to the fence and pushed the torch down into the saddlebag and buckled it shut, and he told Walker in a low voice that he would be back shortly, and he turned again and walked up the path and through the door that Wilhelmina Talmadge held open for him. The inside of the house was small and warm and very clean. There was a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area, with a stone fireplace holding banked coals, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, and shelves along one wall holding provisions, books, and a collection of small items that spoke of a life that had been lived carefully and with intention. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling rafters. There was a braided rug on the plank floor. On the mantel above the fireplace was a photograph in a wooden frame, a man and a woman on what was clearly their wedding day, the man with a serious young face and the woman clearly recognizable as a younger Wilhelmina. She set the lamp on the table and turned to face him. He was standing just inside the closed door with his hat in his hands, because he had taken it off without thinking about it the moment he crossed the threshold. "Sit down," she said, and she moved to the fireplace and began poking the coals back to life, and adding a piece of split wood with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this 10,000 times without help. Monroe sat down at the table because he did not seem to have another choice, or rather because every other option seemed suddenly unthinkable. He was a large man, and the chair was proportioned for an ordinary kitchen, and he sat in it with the careful correctness of a man who is aware that he is taking up more space than he should. "I know who sent you," Wilhelmina said, not looking at him, feeding the fire. "I know what you came out here to do." Monroe said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. She turned from the fireplace and looked at him with those calm, clear eyes, and he noticed now that they were dark blue, the color of deep water, and that she had a small scar along her left jawline that was old and faded. She pulled the wrapper tighter around herself and sat down in the rocking chair across the room rather than at the table, putting a deliberate distance between them that was not exactly unfriendly but was thoughtful. "Mr. Crestwood has sent 2 letters and a lawyer," she said, "and now he has sent you, which means he is losing patience." "Yes, ma'am," Monroe said, because it was true and denying it seemed pointless. "And you had a torch." "I did, but you did not light it." He looked at his hands on the table. "No, ma'am, I did not." A silence settled between them, not entirely uncomfortable, which surprised him. The fire was beginning to work now, crackling and throwing proper warmth, and the room was filling with the smell of it, clean wood smoke and the faint sweetness of whatever herbs were drying above them. "I have been here alone for 8 months, Wilhelmina said, and her voice shifted slightly, just enough that a careful listener would have noticed the weight in it. "My husband Thomas died in February, fever. We had been here 4 years. He built this house himself, every log of it." She paused. "I am not leaving it." Monroe looked at the photograph on the mantel, the young man with the serious face. "Mrs. Talmadge," he started. "Crestwood will send others if you go back empty-handed," she said, cutting him off with a gentleness that somehow made it worse than interruption. "I know that. I have known it for some time. I have been trying to think through my options." "What have you come up with?" he asked, and then was startled to realize he had asked it with genuine curiosity, which was not a thing he had felt for a very long time. She looked at him with what might have been the beginning of a slight, tired smile. "Not as much as I would like. My nearest neighbor is Abe Fielding, 3 miles east. There is a sheriff in Casper, but Sheriff Dolan is not a man who crosses Harlan Crestwood. I have written to a land association in Cheyenne, but I have not received a reply. I have a rifle." She paused. "I am a decent shot, but I know that is not a real solution." "No," Monroe agreed. "It is not." He did not know why he was sitting here talking to her. He should leave. He should ride back to Crestwood's ranch and say the job was done, or say he couldn't do it. And one of those answers would get him paid, and the other would get him fired and possibly worse. And neither of them involved sitting at this woman's kitchen table in the middle of the night discussing her options. But his feet would not move, and his mouth, which had been quiet for the better part of 14 months on everything that mattered, seemed to have rediscovered its function. "My name is Monroe Merritt," he said, because it seemed wrong that she didn't know it. "I know," she said simply. He blinked. "You do. You rode into Casper last spring with 3 other men from the Crestwood outfit. You stopped at Haverson's store. I was there buying seed." She looked at him steadily. "I remember people." He thought about that, about the fact that she had registered his existence when he had not registered hers, and found it produced an odd sensation in his chest that he could not immediately name. "Mrs. Talmadge," he said again, and this time she let him finish. "Crestwood does not stop. If I ride back and tell him the place is standing, he will send Prout and 2 others, and they will not stand in the yard with an unlit torch." "I know that too," she said. "Then what are you going to do?" She was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in the chair, looking at the fire. "What are you going to tell him?" It was a question that Monroe had not yet put to himself directly, and the fact that she had just said it in front of him like a glass of cold water forced him to actually look at it. What was he going to tell Crestwood? He could say he'd done it, but the homestead was still standing and someone would know within days. He could say he had failed, which was true but which would have consequences. Or he could say something else entirely, something that had not yet taken shape in his mind. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. Something in her expression shifted, barely perceptible, like a change in the light. "You are not what I expected when I heard the gate. What did you expect?" "Something worse," she said, and there was no judgment in it, just fact. Monroe turned his hat over in his hands. It was a thing he did when he was thinking, and he was doing a great deal of thinking. "How long have you been awake tonight?" "I heard your horse on the creek trail about 20 minutes ago. Walker moves quietly, but sound carries well on a cold night." She tilted her head slightly. "I thought about the rifle. I decided against it. A man who comes alone at night to burn a widow's homestead might also be a man who has not quite decided to do it yet." The frankness of that hit him somewhere deep, right in the place where he had been numbing himself for 14 months, and it hit him hard enough that he had to breathe through it before he could speak again. That was a very large risk to take. "Yes," she agreed. "It was. But I have found that most risks worth taking are large ones." She paused. "And I was right about you, it seems." The fire settled and popped, throwing sparks up the chimney. Monroe looked at this woman, this widow who had been alone for 8 months on a piece of land that a powerful man wanted, who had heard a rider in her yard in the dead of night, and had made the calculated decision to open her door and hold a lamp and speak calmly, and he felt something unlatch in the center of him, something that had been shut for a long time. "I will not go back to Crestwood tonight," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. "If I return in the morning and tell him the job is not done, he will fire me and send Prout. If I tell him it is done and he finds out otherwise, he will do worse than fire me." He stopped. "But there may be another way." She was watching him very carefully now. "There is a man in Cheyenne named Aldous Farr," Monroe said. "He is a federal land agent. He has been looking at Crestwood's acquisitions for the better part of a year because some of them do not look right on paper. I know this because I have delivered documents between Crestwood and his lawyers that I was not supposed to read but that were not sealed." He looked at her directly. "If you could get that information to Farr, if you could document what Crestwood has done to your property title and others, you might have a case that makes federal involvement possible. And a federal investigation is the one thing Harlan Crestwood cannot buy his way out of in a hurry." Wilhelmina's posture had changed, not obviously, but she was leaning slightly forward now. "What kind of documents would I need?" "Your original land grant. Any correspondence from Crestwood or his lawyer. Records of the other homesteads he has pressured or burned. If you know other families who have been forced off their land, their testimony would matter." "The Hendersons lost their claim on Battle Creek last spring," she said immediately, her mind clearly already moving. "They set a fire. Everyone knew it was not accidental, but no one could prove it. The McCready family sold to Crestwood's land company in June for a price that Harriet McCready told me privately was half what the land was worth, and she said they sold because they were afraid." She paused. "How do you know all this? About Farr?" Monroe was quiet for a moment. "Because I have been doing work I am not proud of for 14 months, he said. "And a man with any conscience left, even a small one, keeps a certain amount of information in the back of his mind. In case." "In case of what?" "In case he finds a reason to use it." They looked at each other across the warm kitchen, and Monroe was aware that something had shifted between them, some fundamental change in the nature of what this encounter was, in the way that a landscape looks different before and after a storm, even if you cannot immediately say what precisely has changed. "You would be giving up your position with Crestwood," she said. "More than that, if he thought you had helped me, it could be dangerous for you." "Yes." "Why would you do that?" He turned his hat over in his hands one more time and then set it on the table with the decision a man makes when he puts something down and means to leave it there. "Because you opened your door," he said, and he wasn't sure he could explain it more precisely than that, but it seemed to be enough, because she nodded as though it made perfect sense. "It is very late," she said, rising from the rocking chair. "Your horse needs water. There is a trough in the barn. You can sleep in the barn tonight if you are willing to sleep in a barn, and tomorrow morning we will make a plan." Monroe stood as well, and standing they were nearly of a height. She was taller than most women he had encountered, and he was aware of her proximity in the small, warm room in a way that was not improper but was undeniably present. "You trust me enough for that. You had a torch and you put it back in your saddlebag," she said simply. "That is enough for tonight." He nodded, and he picked up his hat, and he went out into the cold to see to Walker. The barn was small but dry, with 2 stalls and a loft, and it held a milk cow named Agnes who regarded Monroe with deep bovine suspicion, but did not make a fuss, and a pair of draft horses that were placid and warm-smelling and shuffled obligingly to one side of their stall to give him room. He settled Walker with water and a measure of oats and spread his bedroll in the loft, and he lay there in the dark listening to the horses breathe and the wind moving in the eaves and thought about the last 14 months, and about a woman who opened doors when she should have barred them, and thought about Harlan Crestwood's money, and about a federal agent named Aldous Farr in Cheyenne. And he did not sleep for a long time, but when he did, it was the deepest sleep he had had in months. In the morning he woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the cow being milked below him. He came down from the loft to find Wilhelmina already at work in the barn, her dark hair braided back now, wearing a heavy coat over her dress, and working with the quick efficiency of a woman who had been handling morning chores alone for the better part of a year. She did not look up immediately when he descended the ladder, and he stood watching her for a moment with a feeling he could not quite catalog, something composed partly of admiration and partly of a warmth that had no reasonable explanation, given that they had known each other for approximately 5 hours. She looked up and met his eyes without any awkwardness. "Coffee is on the stove," she said. "Go on in and I will be there directly." He went inside and found a blue enamel pot on the stove and 2 tin cups on the table, and a pan of biscuits keeping warm in the open oven door, and he poured coffee and sat down and felt, in the most bewildering way, as though he had been here before, as though the shape of the morning in this kitchen was something familiar from a life he had not yet lived. Wilhelmina came in 10 minutes later with a pail of fresh milk, and she set it aside and washed her hands and sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup, and they drank coffee together in the pale morning light that came through the east window and threw long shadows across the plank floor. And Monroe thought that if this was the last quiet morning he ever had, it was a very good one to have. "I have been thinking," she said, setting her cup down. "My land grant documents are in the strongbox under the bed. I have copies of both letters from Crestwood's lawyer. I have a letter that Thomas wrote before he died to the county recorder in Casper, in which he described Crestwood's agent coming to the property and making what Thomas called a coercive offer, meaning the agent implied that the offer should be accepted for reasons the family would not like." She paused. "Thomas was a very precise man. He kept records of everything." "That letter could be important," Monroe said. "I thought it might be someday." She looked at him. "I need to get to Cheyenne. That is the difficulty. It is 2 days' ride, and I cannot leave the livestock for 2 days without someone to tend them, and I cannot safely ride 2 days alone with Crestwood's men potentially watching the road." Monroe thought about this. "I can ride to Fielding's place this morning and ask him to come tend the animals, if he is a friend." "He is," she said. "He and Thomas were close. He will come." "Then I will ride with you to Cheyenne," Monroe said. It came out of him as simply as breathing, as though it were already decided, which he supposed it was. She looked at him with those level dark blue eyes. "That is a very large thing for you to do. I know. Crestwood will know you did not carry out the job. By tonight, when he sends someone to check, he will know the homestead is standing, and if you are gone, he will put the pieces together. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her working through the logic of it, this precise and careful woman who kept records and remembered faces and weighed risks before taking them. "Then we should move quickly," she said. "I will pack what I need. If you ride to Fielding's now and are back by midday, we can be clear of the area before dark." Monroe stood and picked up his hat. "One more thing," he said. "Is there anything on this property that cannot be replaced if Crestwood's men come while we are gone?" Her face changed, something moving across it that he recognized as the thing people feel when they look at what they might lose. She looked at the photograph on the mantel. "I will take the photograph," she said quietly. Thomas's letter is already in the strongbox. The rest is just wood and stone. It is not just wood and stone, Monroe said, and he meant it. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression softened in the way that a tight-held thing softens when it is allowed to rest. No, she agreed, but it can be rebuilt. Some things cannot. He rode to Abe Fielding's claim at a pace Walker could sustain, and he found Fielding outside splitting wood, a weathered man of 50 or so with honest eyes and a posture that spoke of years of hard work taken without complaint. Monroe explained the situation with a directness he had not planned, but which turned out to be the right approach, because Fielding listened without interrupting, and then set down his splitting maul and said, "I have been waiting for someone to do something about Crestwood for 6 months. Tell Mina I will be there within the hour." Monroe rode back, and Wilhelmina was ready. She had the strongbox strapped to her own horse, a sturdy roan mare, and a packed saddlebag, and she was wearing a dark riding coat over her dress and had her hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat. She looked, Monroe thought, like a woman who had been ready for this moment for some time and was simply glad it had finally arrived. They waited for Fielding, who came as promised, and Wilhelmina gave him careful instructions about Agnes and the draft horses and the feed stores, and Fielding looked at her with the protective concern of an older neighbor who has been watching and worrying from a distance and is relieved to see her doing something rather than waiting. He shook Monroe's hand and looked at him steadily before releasing it, the kind of look that is a question and a warning wrapped together, and Monroe held it without flinching, which seemed to satisfy Fielding. They rode south, Wilhelmina and Monroe, out of the creek valley and onto the main trail toward the territorial road, and for the first several miles they rode mostly in silence, the cold morning air bright around them and the sage flats opening out wide on either side. It was good riding country, the kind that made a man feel the size of the world in a way that was more clarifying than frightening, and Monroe found himself drawing breath deeper than he had in a long time. "How long have you been working for Crestwood?" Wilhelmina asked eventually when the Casper outskirts were safely behind them and the road ahead was empty. 14 months, he said. Before that, cattle work mostly. Sometime in Colorado, before that Texas. He paused. I grew up in Texas. My family had a small place near Abilene. My father worked cattle his whole life. He stopped, surprised to have said that much, which was more than he told most people about himself. What happened to it? The place near Abilene, drought and debt, he said. When I was 17, my father sold what he could and moved the family to a cousin's place in Kansas. I went the other direction. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was careful. So you know what it is to lose a place that was yours. It was not a pointed thing she said, but it landed in him precisely. Yes, he said, I know exactly what that is. He paused. Which is why I cannot explain 14 months of working for a man who takes land from people who love it. You can explain it, she said, without judgment. You needed work and you needed money and the work was there, and you told yourself it wasn't your business, and eventually you nearly did something you could not have taken back. He looked at her sideways. You speak very plainly. I have found it saves time, she said, and there was a dry quality to it that might have been the beginning of a sense of humor he had not seen the night before. Do you find it uncomfortable? I find it refreshing, he said honestly. She smiled then, a real one, not the tired small ghost of one he had seen in the kitchen. It changed her face considerably, and Monroe looked at the road ahead with some concentration for the next few minutes. They made camp the first night at a spring that Monroe knew from earlier travels, a good sheltered spot with a screen of cottonwoods that blocked the wind and gave them cover from the road. He built a fire small and efficient, the kind that gives heat without much light, a habit from years of being careful, and Wilhelmina produced biscuits from her saddlebag and dried meat, and a tin of preserved peaches that she opened with a knife and divided between them with the matter-of-fact ease of a woman accustomed to making do. They ate by the fire, and the night pressed in close and cold around the small circle of warmth, and the horses stood quiet nearby, and Monroe found himself in the unfamiliar position of having nothing he needed to guard against and nothing he needed to perform. And it was an odd feeling, not unpleasant, like taking off a coat you have been wearing so long you forgot its weight. "Tell me about Thomas," he said, which surprised him again, but he had the feeling that she wanted to talk about Thomas and had no one to talk to. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. He was from Ohio. He came west because he wanted land of his own, which is not an uncommon story. He was 22 when he filed the claim, and I was 20 when I came out to marry him. We had been corresponding for a year. He was a very earnest letter writer, very precise. She smiled at the fire. Some people thought it was a strange way to find a husband, but I had read enough of his letters to know the kind of man he was. The letters did not lie. "How do you know the letters did not lie?" Monroe asked. "Because they described small things truly," she said. "A man who wants to deceive a woman writes large things. He writes about his prospects and his ambitions and his essential goodness. Thomas wrote about the color of the soil at different depths and what it told you about drainage, and about the way the cottonwoods along the creek sounded in the wind, and about a hawk that nested in the barn for one spring and that he had been watching every day. Those are things a liar does not bother with." Monroe thought about that for a long time. "You were happy," he said. "Very," she said simply. And then the fever came, and it was quick. And one morning he was there, and 10 days later he was gone, and the world had a large and inconvenient hole in it. She said it without drama, which made it more affecting than if she had wept, and Monroe looked at the fire and felt the weight of it alongside her in the quiet. 8 months is a long time to manage alone," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But the land was ours, and I was not going to let someone take it simply because I was a woman alone. Thomas would have found that unacceptable, and so do I." "Thomas sounds like a man worth honoring," Monroe said. "He was," she said, and then she looked at Monroe across the fire with an expression that was complicated and honest at once. "You are not what I expected," she said, echoing what she had said the night before, but with a different quality to it now, after a day of riding and talking and learning each other in the way you learn someone when you travel alongside them. "What did you expect?" he asked, as he had asked before. "Less conscience," she said. "Less questions, less." She seemed to search for the word. "Less looking at things as though they matter." He looked at her across the fire and felt the warmth of it on his face, and the cold of the night at his back, and the specific gravity of the moment, which was different from any moment he had experienced in a long time. "Things matter more when you have someone to look at them with," he said, and it was truer than he had intended it to be. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked back at the fire, and there was a quality of deliberate care in the way she did it, as though she were choosing to move slowly through something she wanted to understand fully before she moved further into it. He respected that. He found that he respected almost everything about her. They reached Cheyenne on the afternoon of the second day, coming in from the north through a wind that had picked up on the plains and had turned the ride uncomfortable in the last stretch. Cheyenne in 1878 was a proper town, with a Union Pacific depot and brick buildings going up alongside the older wooden frontier structures, and the streets were active in the way of a territorial capital with a sense of its own expanding importance. They attracted a certain amount of attention. A tall man and a tall woman on good horses, both rode dusty and purposeful, coming in at a pace that said they had somewhere specific to be. The Federal Land Office was on Ferguson Street, a solid building with a painted sign, and Aldous Farr turned out to be a compact, balding man of 45 with extremely sharp brown eyes, and the kind of stillness that very organized minds sometimes have, a quality of complete attention that Monroe associated with people who were very good at what they did. He received them without an appointment, because Monroe presented his name and said it concerned the Crestwood acquisitions in the Powder River Basin, and that was enough. Farr listened for an hour and a half without interruption, which was itself remarkable. Wilhelmina presented Thomas's letter to the county recorder, the correspondence from Crestwood's lawyer, and her original land grant documents. Monroe laid out what he knew about the document transfers, the patterns of offers made under pressure, the barns that had been burned by Crestwood's men, and the names of the families affected. He was careful and precise, and he noticed Farr making detailed notes throughout. At the end of it, Farr set his pen down and looked at them both with those sharp eyes. "This is significant," he said. "We have been building a file on Crestwood for some time, but we have lacked specificity on the pressure tactics and the document manipulation. What you have provided, particularly Mr. Merritt's first-hand account of document content and the Talmadge correspondence, gives us grounds to open a formal federal investigation." "And the homestead?" Wilhelmina asked. "What protection does that give me while an investigation proceeds?" Farr looked at her directly. "I can issue an injunction within 72 hours that prevents any further activity on the Talmadge claim pending the investigation. Crestwood will not be able to touch that property legally, and any illegal action he takes will compound his exposure significantly." He paused. "He is not a foolish man. He will not risk it." Wilhelmina sat very still for a moment, and Monroe watched her absorb this, watched the particular quality of relief that moves through a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and is finally allowed to set it down. She did not cry. She drew one long, quiet breath and then looked at Farr with her chin level and her eyes clear. "How soon can you begin?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning," Farr said. They found rooms at a boarding house on 16th Street, a respectable establishment run by a Mrs. Dunbar who seemed to immediately and correctly identify the nature of the situation, being two tired and road-dusty individuals who required separate and decent accommodations, and who provided both without comment. Monroe paid for his own room from the money in his coat pocket, which was Crestwood's money technically, and which he felt entirely at peace about spending under the circumstances. That evening, after washing the road off themselves, they found each other in the small parlor that the boarding house provided for guests, where there was a fire and a lamp and 2 chairs, and they sat and talked for 3 hours with a freedom and ease that was different from the 2 nights before, because the urgency was past, and what remained was simply 2 people who found each other genuinely interesting and were not yet ready to stop talking. Wilhelmina told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, the middle of 5 children of a schoolteacher father, and a mother who had been a seamstress before marriage, and who had given all her daughters a thorough and practical education in both books and survival. Monroe told her about Texas, more than he had said the night before, about the land near Abilene and his father who had a gift with horses, and his mother who had made a good life out of insufficient materials and had never complained about it. He told her about going west at 17 with a horse and a bedroll and $40 and the slow, years-long education and how the West actually operated versus how people from the East imagined it operated. "You could have been someone different," she said at one point, not unkindly, "if things had fallen differently." "So could anyone," he said. "But yes, I should have been more careful about what I was willing to do for money." He paused. "I am going to be more careful from now on." She looked at him in the lamplight. "What will you do after this?" It was a question he had been turning over. He had no position now. Whatever Crestwood did or did not know yet, his time with that outfit was finished. He had money enough for a few months if he was careful. He had skills with horses and cattle and a working knowledge of Wyoming Territory. He had, he supposed, the beginning of something, though he was not entirely sure what to call it yet. "I do not entirely know," he said honestly. "But I am not afraid of work. I can find cattle work, or I might see about filing my own claim." He paused. "I have been thinking about land." She did not say anything to that, but he saw the slight change in her expression, the careful one, the deliberate slowness one, and he held himself still and did not push, because he understood now that she was a woman who needed to understand something fully before she moved into it. And that was not a character flaw but a kind of wisdom. They said good night at a reasonable hour, and Monroe lay in his room at the boarding house and looked at the ceiling and felt for the first time in a long time that he was pointed in a direction that was worth pointing in. Far was as good as his word. The injunction was filed the following morning, and a formal federal investigation into Harlan Crestwood's land acquisition practices in the Powder River Basin was opened within the week. The news traveled as such things do in Wyoming Territory, through the network of small towns and ranch communities and county seats, and it traveled quickly. By the time Wilhelmina and Monroe made the return ride north, Crestwood's foreman Deacon Prout had ridden past the Talmadge homestead without stopping, because someone had already told Prout that there was a federal injunction on that land, and that touching it would be the fastest possible way to make bad matters catastrophically worse. Abe Fielding met them at the property line with his hat in his hand, and his eyes bright with something close to celebration. He had been tending the animals faithfully, and had made 2 small repairs to the barn roof that Wilhelmina had not asked him to make, but that clearly needed doing. He shook Monroe's hand again, and this time the look he gave him was simpler and warmer, the look of a man who has revised his initial assessment in a favorable direction. The homestead was intact. The kitchen garden in its winter bare rows, the split-rail fence, the rose bushes, the log walls and the shingle roof, the stone chimney from which smoke was beginning to rise again within an hour of their arrival. Monroe stood outside and looked at it in the thin November light, and then he looked at Wilhelmina standing beside him looking at the same thing, and the quality of her expression was one of the most moving things he had ever witnessed, private and vast, the love that a person has for a place that is part of their history and their grief and their future all at once. He did not go back to Crestwood's ranch. There was nothing to go back for. He sent a brief written note through a mutual acquaintance that contained simply the information that he would not be returning, which he suspected Crestwood already knew. The investigation would take months to run its full course, and during those months Crestwood was not a man who had much attention to spare for one former employee. Monroe filed for a boarding room at Haverson's store in Casper, which Haverson ran as a side business, and he found work immediately with a cattle outfit east of town run by a solid rancher named Peak, who needed an experienced hand for the winter work and didn't ask many questions. The pay was reasonable and the work was straightforward, and Monroe found that straightforward work done for a man whose methods were honest felt entirely different from the same physical tasks performed under Crestwood. He rode out to the Talmadge homestead on his first free Sunday, and then on the one after that, and then it became a pattern without any formal discussion about whether it was a pattern. He came on Sundays and sometimes on a Wednesday if the work allowed it, and he helped with the things that needed 2 people or that were simply easier with help. He split wood without being asked, and repaired a section of the fence line that the frost had heaved and got under the barn roof to reinforce a beam that Fielding had identified as beginning to soften. Wilhelmina made coffee and fed him meals, and they talked. They talked about everything. She was reading a book on crop rotation and soil science that she had ordered from a publisher in Chicago, and she wanted to know what he thought about certain soil types, and he knew more than she expected him to about that because of his father, and so they talked about soil. They talked about the investigation, which Farr kept them apprised of through periodic letters, and it was progressing into territory that was increasingly serious for Crestwood, who had retained a lawyer in Washington and was spending considerable money trying to control the situation. They talked about the Henderson family on Battle Creek, who had come forward to provide testimony about their burned barn, and about 2 other families who had done the same. They talked about Thomas, because Monroe had found that she liked to talk about Thomas with someone who listened, and did not try to make her feel she should be finished grieving, and he found that listening to her talk about Thomas did not produce the jealousy that one might expect, but rather something more like respect, a respect for a man who had written truly about small things and built a house that still stood. What Monroe felt for Wilhelmina was not a simple thing. It was not the swift, uncomplicated pull of attraction, though that was part of it. It was something built of layers, of every conversation and every Sunday morning in the kitchen, and every moment of watching her move through her life with the particular combination of competence and tenderness that he had never encountered in quite that form. It was something that had to do with the match he had not struck and the door she had opened and everything that had come after, and it was building in him the way a river builds behind a dam, steady and inevitable and increasingly difficult to contain. He was fairly certain she felt it too. He was not entirely certain she was ready for it, and so he was patient, which was not a thing he would have previously described as his primary virtue. December came and brought snow, and the winters in the Powder River Basin were serious business. Monroe's cattle work went indoors mostly, the kind of winter maintenance that kept animals alive and structures sound, and his Sundays at the Talmadge place took on a different quality, enclosed by cold and snow and firelight, the two of them in the small warm kitchen with the lamp turned up and the fire going and the outside world reduced to white silence. One Sunday in early December, he arrived to find her struggling with a stovepipe joint that had come loose in the night, filling the kitchen with smoke, and he spent an hour on the roof in the cold reseating it while she directed from below with a precision that, under different circumstances, would have been annoying but that he found purely admirable. When he came back inside and they had the smoke cleared and the fire going properly, she made coffee and set 2 cups on the table and then looked at him with those dark blue eyes and said, "I would like to ask you something." "All right," he said. "Do you plan to stay in this territory?" He met her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I do." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Abe Fielding's nephew is selling a parcel 2 miles south of here, small with a creek frontage. Abe mentioned it to me last week, and I think he mentioned it because he thought you might be interested." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "Abe Fielding is a direct man." "Very," she said. "He likes you. He liked Thomas as well, which I think in Abe's mind constitutes a connection." Monroe looked at his coffee cup and then at her. "Is it a parcel you think is worth having?" "I think it is very good land," she said carefully. "I think a man with good skills and honest intent could build something there worth having." She paused, and the deliberate care was there again, the choosing carefully quality. "I think that person would be a good neighbor." "A neighbor," Monroe said. "For a start," she said, and she looked at him straight and clear, and there it was, laid out with the same matter-of-fact honesty with which she approached everything. And Monroe felt something in his chest loosen into warmth with a completeness that rendered him briefly wordless. He rode out to look at the Fielding nephew's parcel the following week, and made an offer on it the week after that. It was a fair price for good land, and what money he had saved from his cattle work covered it barely, which meant he would be starting lean. But lean with good land and clear water was a starting point that plenty of men had built something worthwhile from. On Christmas Day, 1878, Abe Fielding and his wife Dorothea hosted a small gathering that included Monroe and Wilhelmina, and the Fieldings' grown daughter and her husband. And they had a goose and potatoes and 2 pies and a great deal of warmth and noise. And Monroe sat at a table crowded with people for the first time in years and felt the shape of belonging, imprecise still but real and immediate. Walking Wilhelmina back to her homestead in the dark after supper, through snow that came to their ankles and moonlight that made the world silver and still, Monroe stopped on the path and turned to face her, and he said, "I would like to court you properly if you are willing." She looked at him in the moonlight, and the careful, deliberate quality was present, and then she said, "I have been expecting you to say that for about 6 weeks." He laughed, which was a sound that surprised both of them by its entirety, a real laugh, unguarded, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went up into the cold Wyoming dark and scattered like birds startled from cover. "And," he said. "And yes," she said, "I am willing." He courted her through January and February and into the early thaw of March, and it was a courtship that suited both of their natures, unhurried and substantive, full of conversation and the slow deepening of knowledge that is the real foundation of love rather than its dramatics. He brought her books from Casper because he had noticed which subjects interested her, and she baked things that she left wrapped at the door of his new place when she rode past on her way to Haverson's, and they rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, not always talking, sometimes simply moving through the country together in a companionship that said more than words were needed to say. He told her in February about the 2 barns he had stood near while they burned, and the families he had helped push off their land, the full accounting of it, and he told it without softening it. She listened to all of it, and then she was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke she said, "I am glad you told me, and I think you know the difference between what a man does and what a man is, or you would not have stopped when you did." "I should have stopped before," he said. "Yes," she agreed with that plain honesty that had undone him the first night. "You should have, but the fact that you did stop and that you are troubled by it is the relevant thing now." He looked at her and felt something very close to love, close enough that it was probably indistinguishable from the real thing by any practical measure. In March, Aldous Farr wrote a letter informing Wilhelmina that the federal investigation had produced sufficient evidence to bring charges against Harlan Crestwood for fraudulent land acquisition practices and conspiracy to commit arson, specifically the Henderson barn on Battle Creek, and the Macready fire that had been ruled accidental, but which 3 witnesses now placed squarely at the feet of Deacon Prout acting under Crestwood's instruction. Crestwood had agreed to a settlement in the federal case that included payment of fair market value to the affected families and the return of 2 land parcels that had been acquired under documented coercion. The Talmadge homestead was unaffected by the settlement because the injunction had protected it throughout. The day Wilhelmina received that letter, she rode to Monroe's place and knocked on the door and stood on the threshold with the letter in her hand and tears on her face for the first time he had ever seen. And he opened the door wide and she walked in, and he put his arms around her and she let him. And they stood there for a long time in the doorway of his new house on the land, 2 miles from hers, with the March wind coming in from the north and the first distant greening of things visible in the south-facing creek bank through the window. "It is over," she said, against his shoulder. "It is over," he said, into her hair. He asked her to marry him on an afternoon in April when the rose bushes along her fence line were showing their first leaves, and he did it without elaborate preparation or theatrical gesture, because those things did not suit either of them, and also because he suspected she would find excessive theater faintly absurd, and he found he could not bear to be faintly absurd in front of her. He simply asked her, standing by the fence, looking at the new leaves on the roses, and she said yes in the same way she had said it about the courtship, clear and direct and without hesitation, but with a warmth under it that was entirely her own. They were married in June of 1879 in Casper, at the small Episcopal church on the main street, which was a modest affair with Abe and Dorothea Fielding as witnesses, and a minister named Reverend Shack, who had a kind manner and a mercifully brief sermon. Wilhelmina wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the winter, and Monroe wore his best coat, which was not an exceptional coat, but was the best he had, and they stood together at the front of the small church and made their promises to each other with the direct and quiet sincerity of 2 people who had both known enough of the world to understand the weight of what they were promising. Abe Fielding cried, which he maintained afterward had been the dust from the road. They held both properties through that first year of marriage, because the practical question of where to live resolved itself naturally when they looked at the assets clearly. Wilhelmina's homestead was the better built and longer established, with the kitchen garden and the producing cow and the layout that worked. Monroe's parcel had the creek frontage and the additional acreage that would allow them to expand their cattle operation beyond what one person could manage. They kept both, working both, and began the process of building their combined operation into something worth having. Monroe proved to be as good with horses as his father had been, which turned out to be a considerable economic asset in Wyoming Territory, where good horses were always needed, and men who could handle them well were consistently in demand. He began supplementing their cattle income with horse training work that other ranchers in the area brought to him, and Wilhelmina's kitchen garden expanded to something that could genuinely supplement the household rather than merely supplementing it a little. She began selling produce at the Casper market on Saturdays, and she had the kind of mind for numbers and organization that turned a market table into a genuinely profitable enterprise. The first winter of their marriage was different from the winter before it in ways that Monroe found himself thinking about in the specific way. A man thinks about something he did not expect to be as large as it turned out to be. He had lived alone for so many years that he had forgotten what it was to have the weight of a house shared, the way another person's presence changes the quality of silence, makes it friendly rather than empty, makes the cold outside feel like something to be appreciated rather than endured. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had never fully known, what it was to sit across from someone at a table and feel that there was nowhere else to be. Wilhelmina was not a simple person to love. She was opinionated and precise, and had very definite ideas about how certain things should be done, and she was not inclined to soften those ideas for social ease. She had a tendency to read at the table when she was between tasks, which Monroe initially found startling and then found endearing, and then found that he looked forward to. The image of her sitting with a book propped against the sugar bowl and her coffee going cold at her elbow. She mourned Thomas in ways that were private and that Monroe respected entirely, understanding that love is not a finite resource, and that a woman who loved her first husband well was a woman who knew how to love, which was not a thing to fear but a thing to value. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. He arrived in April, with a force and volume of opinion that suggested he was going to be particular about things from the beginning, and they named him Thomas Monroe Merritt, which was Wilhelmina's idea, and which Monroe accepted with a fullness of feeling that he did not entirely have words for. The Thomas was for Thomas Talmadge, and Monroe found that carrying that name in his child's name felt right, felt like honoring something that deserved to be honored. Little Thomas was a robust and demanding infant who had his mother's dark blue eyes and his father's determined jaw, and the combination proved, as time went on, to be formidable. Abe Fielding came to see the baby and sat with him in the crook of his arm for a long time with an expression of profound satisfaction, as though the arrival of this particular child were a thing he had personally arranged and was justified in feeling pleased about. The ranch on Willow Creek, which was what people in the area had taken to calling the combined Merritt operation, grew steadily through the early 1880s. They added cattle to the herd that Monroe tended through harsh winters with the patient commitment of a man who understands that land requires faithfulness as much as labor. They added a second barn, built jointly with Fielding's help and the help of two neighbors, the kind of barn raising that represented the best of what community in the West could be when the West was functioning as it should. Wilhelmina added chickens and a second cow and expanded the garden again, and she also began teaching reading and arithmetic to 3 children of neighboring families whose parents could not manage the 40-mile round trip to Casper's school, which became a 4th child and then a 5th. And the kitchen table became a schoolroom on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, with a regularity that Thomas found fascinating as he grew old enough to observe it. Monroe rode into Casper one evening in the fall of 1881 and stopped at the sheriff's office, where a new sheriff had been installed following Dahlen's retirement the previous spring. The new sheriff was a young man named Harker who had come from Missouri and who wore his badge without apology, and had made several early decisions that suggested he intended to use it for the purpose it was meant for. Monroe liked him on principle, and had come to report that he had seen 2 riders in the Creek Valley who had the look of men scouting property in ways that raised certain memories. Harker listened carefully and thanked him and said he would look into it, and he did, and it turned out to be less than Monroe had feared. 2 men looking at open land legitimately, but Monroe felt good about having said something, and Harker noted afterward that Monroe Merritt was the kind of man a sheriff was glad to have in his county. There were difficult seasons, as there are always difficult seasons. A bad drought in 1882 that withered the kitchen garden and reduced the creek to a trickle, and cost them 2 head of cattle to the dryness and heat. Monroe and Wilhelmina worked through it the way they had come to work through hard things, together and without falling into blame or despair, assessing what they had and what they needed and making the best decisions available. They borrowed from their savings and bought water where they could, and the following year, when the rains came back in proper measure, they rebuilt what had been reduced and were no worse for it in the long view, though the short view had been genuinely difficult. Their daughter, born in 1883, arrived with considerably more tranquility than Thomas had, a composed and observant infant who watched the world from her first days with an expression of serious evaluation. They named her Ruth, for Wilhelmina's mother, and Ruth grew into a child who was indeed serious and observant, and who learned to read at an age that startled even Wilhelmina, who was not easily startled. Thomas, by that time 3 years old, had developed opinions about everything, including Ruth's existence, which he initially viewed with suspicion, and then with proprietary affection, deciding that a small sister was a sufficiently interesting addition to be worth accepting. Monroe watched his son standing over the baby's cradle with that expression of uncertain ownership, and felt something enormous and quiet, and without adequate language. By 1884, the Crestwood case was fully resolved through the federal court system. Harlan Crestwood had been convicted on 3 counts of fraudulent land acquisition and 1 count of conspiracy to commit arson. He had paid substantial fines and served a prison sentence, and his land company had been dissolved. The news reached Casper in the form of a letter from Aldous Farr, who was still at the federal land office in Cheyenne, and who wrote in his precise, still hand that he thought Mrs. Merritt and her husband would wish to know that the matter was fully and formally concluded. Wilhelmina read the letter at the kitchen table with Monroe sitting across from her and Thomas doing something complex and private with a set of wooden blocks in the corner and Ruth asleep in the cradle nearby. And when she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it down and looked at Monroe with those dark blue eyes that he had been reading for 5 years by then and could read quite well. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time in the kitchen of the house that Thomas Talmadge had built, and that Monroe Merritt had spent 5 years making his own alongside the woman who had opened the door and changed the course of everything. The question of the homestead's future had resolved itself in the way that good things resolve when the pressure is off and the time is sufficient. They had filed the combined property as a single claim under Merritt, with a careful notation in the county records of the original Talmadge claim that Wilhelmina had insisted upon, saying that Thomas had built it and his name should be part of its record, and Monroe had agreed without hesitation, and the county recorder had made the notation, and the land was theirs in every legal and practical sense, while remaining connected to the history it deserved to carry. In the spring of 1885, they planted new rose bushes along the fence line, which had expanded considerably by then, to replace the ones that had not survived 2 rough winters. Wilhelmina chose varieties from a catalog she had ordered from a nursery in Ohio, consulting the descriptions with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and Monroe turned the soil along the fence posts with a spade and mixed in the compost from the kitchen garden with the patience of a man who has learned that the best things require proper preparation. Thomas, who was 5, helped with determined seriousness and got considerably more soil on himself than in the ground. And Ruth, who was nearly 2, supervised from the hip of her father's arm with her customary expression of thoughtful evaluation. Standing by the fence on a May afternoon with soil on his hands and Walker grazing in the paddock beyond, and the smell of turned earth and new growth all around him, and Wilhelmina kneeling in the dirt to settle a root ball into its hole with the focused tenderness she brought to living things, Monroe Merritt looked at all of it, the house and the land and the creek bright with snowmelt, and the sky enormous and blue above the basin. And he thought about a cold October night 7 years ago when he had pushed a gate open with an unlit torch in his saddlebag, and a woman had opened a door, and the entire trajectory of his life had pivoted on that single moment the way a river pivots on a rock. Deep in its bed, silent and total and permanently changing what came after. He had spent 14 months being a man he did not want to be, and then a woman had opened a door, and here he was. "You are staring," Wilhelmina said, without looking up from the rosebush. "I am," he agreed. "At what?" He looked at her, kneeling in the dirt with her dark hair coming loose from its pins and soil on her hands and a focused line between her brows, and he thought about precision and patience and dark blue eyes, and a lamp held out in the dark, and a voice that had said it was a cold night and come inside, and he thought about the long road from there to here, and how it had contained more grace than he had deserved, and how he intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. "At this," he said, "all of it." She looked up then, and she looked at him in the way she had looked at him across a fire on the first night of that long ride, clear and full and without the deliberate slowness anymore, because she had understood it fully by now and moved through it with the confidence of someone who knows the country, and she said, "It is a good thing to look at." "The best thing," he said. Ruth made a sound from his hip that was her considered opinion on the quality of the rosebushes, and Thomas announced that he had found a worm of extraordinary size, and that everyone should come and observe it. And Wilhelmina laughed and got to her feet and went to her son, and crouched down to appropriately appreciate the worm. And Monroe stood in the May afternoon of 1885 on the land that love and stubbornness and an open door had saved, and he felt the particular, uncomplicated joy of a man who has found his right place in the world and knows it. The summer of 1885 was generous, the rains coming in proper measure and the garden producing abundantly, and the cattle operation running with the smooth efficiency that comes from years of accumulated knowledge and properly maintained infrastructure. Monroe's horse training work had grown to the point that he had built a second small paddock and a round pen specifically for the purpose, and he had more inquiries than he could take in any given month, which was a comfortable problem to have. Wilhelmina's informal school had grown to 9 children by September of that year, which was more than the kitchen table could accommodate, and she wrote a careful letter to the Casper School Board asking what the procedure was for establishing a proper rural schoolhouse, and she received a response that was encouraging if bureaucratic, and she navigated the bureaucracy with the same organized precision she brought to everything. And by the following spring, there was a small schoolhouse being planned for a piece of land that Abe Fielding, who was approaching 60 now, and was the patriarch of the Creek community in every way but formal title, had offered without being asked. Fielding's wife Dorothea had become Wilhelmina's closest friend in the way of women who find in each other a complementary quality, Dorothea's warmth and generosity providing a counterbalance to Wilhelmina's precise and self-contained nature that benefited both of them. Their children played together, and the two households operated with an easy exchange of resources and assistance that was the genuine article of what community was supposed to be. Monroe and Abe Fielding had settled into the particular friendship of men who respect each other's competence and share a fundamental orientation toward things, men who can work alongside each other all day without needing to fill the silence, and who find the silence better for the other person's presence in it. Abe had, over the years, said several things to Monroe that Monroe had turned over in his mind and kept. Things about land and weather, and the longer view that the older man's experience had earned, and that Monroe stored with the attentiveness of someone who knows that wisdom is a finite resource and should not be wasted. One evening in the fall of 1886, sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, Monroe and Wilhelmina were watching the last light leave the sky over the basin, the deep blue darkening to violet, and then to the particular near black that precedes the first stars, and Wilhelmina said something that had clearly been working in her for some time. "I have been thinking about the other families," she said. "The ones that Crestwood displaced, the Hendersons, the Macritys. They were compensated by the federal settlement, but compensation is not the same as restoration. The Hendersons are in Casper now, in a rental, and Harriet Macritty told Dorothea that they are thinking of leaving Wyoming altogether." Monroe listened. "The Macritty claim on the South Fork would make a good start for someone who knew how to work it," she said. "The settlement returned the deed, but the family does not want to go back to it because of what it represents. I wonder if there is a way to help connect them with someone who would want it." She paused. "I wonder if there are young men coming into this territory who need land and who cannot afford the prices that are being asked, and whether the Macrides would consider a payment arrangement." Monroe looked at her in the gathering dark. This was how her mind worked, identifying a shape in a problem, and then finding the people who fit that shape and the mechanism that connected them, and she had been doing it with increasing scope and effect for years. "That is a good thought," he said. "It would require someone to facilitate the arrangement, someone who knows the land values and has relationships with both the families involved and the prospective buyers. It would require someone organized," he said. "Yes," she said, and there was a quality in her voice that said she was thinking about this as a specific project rather than a general notion. Within a year, Wilhelmina Merritt had quietly facilitated the transfer of the Macritty claim to a young couple from Illinois, the Abbotts, who were 22 and 24, and had come west with energy and capital insufficient for the prices in the more established areas. She had connected them with the Macritys, negotiated a payment arrangement that was fair to both parties, and provided the Abbotts with a detailed written summary of everything she knew about the land, the creek, the soil types, and the peculiarities of the local climate. The Abbotts were profoundly grateful, and the Macritys wrote a letter from their new situation in Colorado, saying that they felt a particular peace about how it had resolved. She did it twice more over the following years, for different families and different parcels, building a quiet expertise in land arrangements that was purely informal but genuinely effective. And that earned her a reputation in the county for being someone you came to when you needed to understand how a property situation could be untangled. She did not charge for it. She did it because it was the thing she could do and it needed doing, and Monroe understood this completely and was proud of her in a way that was specific and not merely generic, proud of her particular mind applied to a particular problem in a particular world. Their third child came in 1887, a boy they named Abe, which caused Abe Fielding to have to excuse himself from the room when they told him, on the grounds that something had gotten in his eye. Young Abe arrived with the same composed quality as Ruth rather than the forceful urgency of Thomas, a child who seemed to observe the world and form opinions about it before expressing them, which turned out to be a characteristic that persisted as he grew. Thomas, by 7, was his father's shadow in the round pen and the paddock, having developed an attachment to horses that Monroe recognized immediately and completely, because it was the same thing he had inherited from his own father, that particular attentiveness to horses that is not learned, but is simply present in certain people from the beginning. He began teaching Thomas what he knew, and the teaching was in itself a kind of accounting, laying out the knowledge that had come to him from his father's hands, and finding it more extensive than he had realized, preserved intact through all the years and the wandering and the poor choices, waiting to be passed forward. In the autumn of 1888, Monroe rode to Casper on a Tuesday and stopped at the county recorder's office, and when he came back, he had a document that he set on the kitchen table in front of Wilhelmina while she was going over her Tuesday school preparations. She looked at it. It was a properly filed deed for the Merritt property on Willow Creek, updated with a legal notation that read in the county's standard language, Talmadge Merritt Homestead original claim filed by Thomas Wilhelmina Talmadge, 1874. She looked up at him. "I asked Harker if it was possible," Monroe said. "He said the recorder would do it. He was right." She looked back at the document and she was quiet for a long time, and Monroe waited in the way he had learned to wait for her, giving her time to go through a thing at her own pace. "Thomas would have liked you," she said finally. Monroe sat down across from her. "I like to think so." She folded her hands on the document and looked at him with the full, clear steadiness of a woman who has come through a great deal and is standing on solid ground. "He wrote about small things truly," she said, "and so do you." He put his hand over hers on the document. "I have a good example to follow," he said. Outside, the October light was coming through the east window in the particular way it had at this time of year, low and golden and laying long shadows across the plank floor. And from the direction of the paddock came the sound of Thomas talking to a horse in the careful and patient way he was learning. And somewhere upstairs Ruth was reading audibly to herself, as she did when she thought no one could hear. And young Abe was sleeping in the good solid afternoon sleep of a well-fed baby. And the rose bushes along the fence had gone to their hips and their thorny winter architecture in the way they always did at this time of year, and would bloom again in June, as they had bloomed every June, since Wilhelmina had planted the new ones in 1885. And as the originals had bloomed in every June since Thomas Talmadge had planted them in the first years of the homestead, and the stone chimney was drawing well, and the kitchen was warm, and the sound of the creek came in faintly through the thick log walls on particularly quiet days, and this was all of it. All the life that a man could build if he stopped at the right moment, and turned around and put down the torch he was carrying, and walked through the door that someone brave enough to open it was holding for him. Monroe Merritt had come to burn Wilhelmina Talmadge's homestead on orders from a man who was now in prison, and she had opened the door before he could strike the match, and he had not been able to move, and that single failure of will on a cold October night in 1878 had turned out to be the most important thing he had ever done, the moment everything before it ended and everything worth having began. He sat at the kitchen table with his hand over his wife's hands on a document that held two names, and outside the Wyoming light moved across the land that they worked and tended and loved, and none of them were going anywhere. This was the place, and this was the life, and it was very good.